Hello, welcome to the Learnfast CSS 20 course. The Art of Styling Web Pages. In this section we're going to be covering CSS models and properties. The contents, software engineering, and we have in this part of the course we have CSS features, selecting a group, what is a CSS Cascade, CSS Selector scoping, HTML element scoping, CSS Box Model concept, Box Model Properties, property sizing, font properties, font decoration, font spacing, font alignment, font transformation, and CSS Colors. Okay, welcome to CSS Models and Properties. Beginning of the course. Selecting a group. With CSS, you can apply a CSS formatting rule to more than one element or selector. You can do this by separating the selectors by commas in your CSS file. For example, we have a paragraph selector, we have a comma, then we have an ID selector, and then we have a top class selector. These two, the paragraph and the top text selector, are grouped together. And then in brackets we have the rule definition, color green, font courier, font size 3em. What is a CSS Cascade? With CSS, a very basic concept is the CSS Cascade. Cascade refers to something that is falling or flowing down a staircase or ladder like a waterfall. This means the CSS rule defined at the top of the ladder, for example in an external file, takes precedence if no other rules come after it. As you approach the bottom of the ladder, any rules defined closer to the element will take priority and replace earlier rule definitions. What is a CSS Cascade? As mentioned earlier, CSS Cascade is a waterfall concept. So we start off with CSS Cascade. We start off with the web browser's default styles, and then we go down to in our waterfall to the user-defined styles in the web browser, and we go down to the external CSS file that we use to define our CSS rules, and then within the web page itself we have the HTML CSS blocks defining style sheets, and then finally within the element itself we have the style attribute where we can define more styling rules. And eventually after that we get to the HTML element itself, and all of the rules above will get applied to it. But if there are any overlapping rules, only the latest rules will be applied. So that means starting with your HTML element, the first rule that's going to be applied is the element CSS, and if there's no element CSS, then the next level that will be applied will be the HTML page block CSS, and next level up will be the external file CSS, and then the next level up will be the user default styles in the web browser, and finally you'll have the web browser system defaults styles, which come with the web browser when it's installed. Okay, CSS Selector scoping. With a CSS Selector, you can determine the scope of the selector rule fairly easily as follows. By scope, we mean how many items does the CSS Selector rule apply to. Sometimes it may only apply to one element in the HTML page, sometimes it may apply to multiple elements. So looking at the table, we can see that the ID CSS Selector, for example top text, ID top text, the ID only is, by definition, only applies to one element. The ID can only be used in one element in a HTML web page, so that is the smallest number of items that you can apply to. Going back to the class can be applied to multiple elements, for example .top class, and when the class is applied to multiple elements, that's a group of elements that can have the class applied to them. And then we have the broadest category, which is the element itself. And for example, the div element, any rules applied to div will apply to all divs within a web page, and there may be hundreds of divs elements within the web page. Okay, HTML element scoping. As with scoping of CSS rules, we can have HTML elements having their own scope. Also with HTML, the scoping of elements can vary as follows. There are three main concepts: the CSS box model, the block container, and the inline container elements. For example, the CSS box model applies to all CSS elements. Every element in a HTML page is surrounded by a box. The CSS box model describes how CSS applies rules to the elements. Every element is surrounded by a box, and the rule is applied to that box only. The box can have padding, margin, and border properties. So when a rule is applied, the browser puts every element within its own box, so it's within a container. And when the web browser applies a rule, it applies the rule to the container box of the element. The other scoping item we have is the block container. For example, a div is a block container, which means that any elements within a div section will be displayed as a block. So the HTML div section is a blocks element, in that whatever is contained inside a div section is a block that takes the whole width of the web page for all of the rows utilized. So this means it takes the whole width of the web page. So one div will contain at least minimum of one line, can contain multiple lines in the block. So the next element is a smaller container, which is the inline section container. And for example, the span element can be used to span one word in a paragraph, and it will only affect the contents between the two span tags, the opening span tag and the closing span tag. A span element around, for example, a piece of text takes on the width of the enclosed element, example span, and this is text. This text is span text, so if you want to format an element on a line, you can do so without affecting the rest of the line. Okay, CSS box model concept. As mentioned before, every element in a web page, when it's displayed by the web browser, every element is contained within a box. So the CSS box model says all CSS elements. The CSS box model describes how CSS applies rules to elements. Every element is surrounded by a box, and the rule is applied to that box only. The box can have padding, border, and margin properties. In our diagram here, the CSS box model, we've got representation of that. We have our HTML element right at the middle, and then on the first level on the outside we have the padding, and that can be different sizes, different colors, and styled in CSS. Then we have the border, and that can be different size, different colors in the CSS styling. And then finally on the outside we have the margin, which is the again can be different sizes, different widths, and different colors. So that was the CSS box model concept. Okay, well, moving on to the CSS box model properties. CSS box model properties determine the width and height of each element when displayed on the screen by the web browser. The padding, border, and margin properties of the CSS box model have default values which will increase the size of the overall space taken by the HTML element when displayed. The CSS box model properties can be set using the margin left and margin right, using the margin left, margin right, margin bottom attributes. CSS box model properties. As mentioned before, the margin, when used in a rule definition, can be applied to all the margins around the CSS box model. For example, you can specify margin left is 3 pixels. Using the CSS properties margin, margin top, margin bottom, margin left, and margin right, we can just alter a particular margin, left or right or top or bottom. Or if we want to affect all margins around the box, then we could just use the word margin. The border of the CSS box we can specify as border colon 3 pixels. Uses the CSS properties border, border top, border bottom, border left, and border right. Padding in the CSS box model can be specified as padding colon 3 pixels. Use CSS properties padding, padding top, padding bottom, padding left, padding right. Okay, CSS property sizing. So when you specify the size of a margin or a border or padding, you can use the different units for specifying the size. For example, you can use pixels. So CSS properties that specify a particular size or width can be stated using a number of different dimensions or standards. For example, border is 3 pixels, margin is 3 EMs. In this table below, we can see the different dimensions that we can use. We can use pixel, which is code is px. So we can say margin left colon 3 pixels, 3px. This specifies the smallest. A pixel is the smallest dot that can be displayed on a computer monitor. inches. This refers to normal inches, so we can say the width of the box can be 1 inch. We can use centimeters as the same to specify the size of the margins and borders. We can use millimeters to specify the size of the margins. We can use points. Now 1 point corresponds to 1 over 72 of an inch, and this is used in the printing industry. When we're going to print a web page, we can specify for printing purposes in points. Also, similarly, we can use picas, which is where 1 picas equals 12 points, or 12 over 72 parts of an inch. We can use EMs. An EM is a relative measure, so we can say, if we say font size colon 12 EMs, so what that is saying is that make the font size 12 times the default font size in the web page. So this is very useful for doing relative spacing of fonts, so you can just change one default font and that will change all of the relative fonts automatically. You can use EX, which is another measurement, and for example we can say width colon 10 EX, and 1 EX corresponds to the height of x, a smaller lowercase x, in your current font size. Also we can use percent. Percentage corresponds to it's a relative measure, so it can, if we say we want the font size to be colon 150%, that means it's going to be 150% of the default font size. CSS properties and sizing. Well, CSS properties that specify a particular size or width can be stated using a number of different dimensions or standards. For example, border 3 pixel 3em, and we can specify, again as mentioned before, we can use different measurements or different units for measuring sizes and widths. In CSS we can use the pixel, we can use the inch, we can use the centimeter, we can use a millimeter, we can use points, we can use picas, we can use EMs, we can use EXs, and we can use percentage. Okay, moving on. CSS font properties. CSS fonts can be styled using the font properties called font family, font style, font size, and font weight. In this table we've got font family. We specify a font family to be used in CSS for text. For example, here we've got font family colon Courier. The default fonts available on most browsers are Arial, Times New Roman, Helvetica, Impact, Arial Black, Georgia, Verdana, Comic Sans, MS, Tribute MS, and Times. These fonts are by default available on most browsers, so if you use one of these you should have no problems displaying your text. Okay, moving on to the font style, we can apply different styles to the font. So we can say font style colon bold, which bolds the text. The styles available are normal, italic, bold, and oblique. font size. We can specify a font size for text that's being displayed. We can say, for example, font size :3 EMs, which is a relative measurement. The usual font sizes that you specify are available. Font sizes that you use can be fixed or relative sizes. Font weight. Now, moving on to our font weight, this determines the darkness or the lightness of the text that's being displayed. For example, we can do font weight is bold. Now, different weights would for normal and for bold fonts. Normally, you just have 2 or 3 weights. You have normal, grey, or bold weights for your font, but you can have lots more. You can have going from 100 to 800. The darkness or the relative weight of your font can be specified in different amounts. CSS font properties. CSS fonts can be styled using the font properties: font family, font style, font size, and font weight, as mentioned. And in this diagram, we've got a diagrammatic presentation of that. So we have the font family attribute, we have the font style attribute, and then we have the font size attribute, and then we have the font weight attribute. Okay, moving on to CSS font decoration. Now, CSS fonts decoration allows you to format the displayed text using different kinds of overlapping decorations. For example, underline, cross through, overline, blinking. So there's lots of different kinds of decorations or patterns you can apply to text. In this table, we've got a list of those. We've got blink, so we can set the text decoration to be blink, where the text will be blinking. To get blinking text, use text decoration. Line through, to get a line through your text, like as though you've deleted it or crossed it out. You can use text decoration : line through to get a line through your text. If you want to underline your text as to highlight it in some way, for example, it may be a hyperlink, you can use underlining, and then you can use text decoration : underline to get underlined text decorations. Overline is applying a line to the top of your text, similar to underline but at the top. Text decoration overline to get overline text decoration. CSS font decoration. CSS fonts decoration allows you to format the displayed text. And this is a diagram of what we've just described, formatting display text. So we've got text decoration blank, we've got text decoration line through, we've got text decoration underline, and then we've got text decoration overline. Okay, CSS font spacing allows you to set the word, line, and letter spacing of text being displayed. For example, CSS font spacing. We can say font spacing is line, so we can say paragraph brackets line height is : 150%. This will set the height of your text to be 150% of the default. For a word, we can say the word spacing, the spacing between words in a paragraph. The word spacing will be 20 pixels. That will set 20 pixels between all of the words in your text. So we can also do letter spacing. So we can say in your paragraph, set the letter spacing to be 3 pixels. So that will insert 3 pixels between each letter of your text. And down below we have a diagram. So we have the line height. the word spacing and the letter spacing, as mentioned above. Okay, moving on. CSS font alignment. CSS allows you to set the total alignment property of your text. You can use different alignment values. We can say left alignment, where the text is left aligned. We can say center alignment, where the text is center aligned. We can say text align is right, which is right aligned text, and we can justify text to say that the text is both left and right justified. CSS font alignment. CSS allows you to set the text alignment property and to align fonts, for example, as just mentioned. And the way we do it is here we say, in this diagram we can display it diagrammatically. Text align left, text align center, text align right, text align justify. CSS font transformation. CSS allows you to transform font and text. In this table we've got the different values you can apply to text transform. So we can say none, text transform none, which means apply no transformations. Text transform capitalize, so we can say capitalize the text. Uppercase, we can say text transform the text to all uppercase. We can say lowercase, we can say text transform to all the text to lowercase, and we can say indent in the text paragraphs, indent the first line by text indent by 20 pixels. CSS font transformation. CSS allows you to transform fonts and text, as mentioned. In this diagram we've got a listing of those text transform properties. So we've got none, text transform none, text transform capitalize, text transform uppercase, text transform lowercase, and text indent 20 pixels. This is for indenting paragraphs. The first line on the paragraph will be indented by 20 pixels for formatting and readability purposes. CSS colors. We can apply different colors to CSS. CSS allows you to apply different colors to the CSS Box Model Properties. So looking in this table, we've got the color attribute. So we can say paragraph color :green. So that will set all of the paragraph text to green. We can say background color. So we can say paragraph background color is red. Set all of the background to the text as red. Now color units are measured in different colors can be measured in different units. We can use the English words like green, blue, red, for example here. Labels, for example red, green, blue. We can also use the RGB numbers settings. So for red, green and blue we've got #CC, which is for the red channel. So that is a number between 0 and 255, and is displayed in hexadecimal, where each column here represents a hexadecimal value. So C represents hexadecimal value, which corresponds to a hexadecimal value. And then we've got FF, which is this corresponds to the green channel, and that will be the value 255. And then we've got the blue channel, which is 00, and that corresponds to 0. So for simplicity, we can also write #CFO, which means it's the first column, here's C, and then the first column F, and then C column, first column 0, and that can save space, and if you're only using a few colours, then that can be much quicker. We can also specify in decimal the RGB values. We can say red, green, blue is brackets 0, 25, 250, 50, and these values range between 0 and 255 in decimal. Okay. Next we can also specify the RGB values in percentage values. So we've got red, green, blue in 10%, 35% and 50%. So 10% would correspond to 10% of 255. As mentioned before, we have the standard color names, the W3C, which is the Worldwide Consortium for the Internet, responsible for setting Internet standards and standards for web pages and HTML, and CSS and JavaScript. They specify 16 standard color names: blue, red, black, aqua, fuchsia, grey, green, lime, maroon, navy, olive, purple, silver, teal, white and yellow. Thanks very much. That was the CSS Models and Properties lecture. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe to our channel, which is Bain's Infotech World. And we'll see you next time.